Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, and welcome to Pakistan in Perspective, a special series examining the state of minority and human rights in Pakistan from a historical, legal, and philosophical perspective. In our last program, we discussed the special case of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community in Pakistan and some of the objective evidence that exists to demonstrate the discrimination that the Ahmadis face in Pakistan. Today's program explores in more detail the anti-blasphemy and anti-minority criminal ordinances that exist in Pakistan, and we will also touch on the issue of political rights of minorities, and in the case of the Ahmadi community, the issue of their exclusion from the joint electorate in Pakistan and other voting restrictions. Joining me to discuss these matters are two very distinguished lawyers from Pakistan. We have Mr. Abid Hassan Minto. He is a senior lawyer and advocate before the Supreme Court of Pakistan and a constitutional law expert. Assalamu alaikum, Mr. Minto. We have Mr. Mujibur Rahman, who is a senior lawyer from Pakistan and advocate before the Supreme Court of Pakistan and an expert on Islamic Sharia law and related subjects. Assalamu alaikum, Mr. Rahman. I wanted to turn to you first, Mr. Minto. In prior programs, we discussed specifically the issue of the 1974 constitutional amendment, the Second Amendment to the Constitution, which defined who is or is not a Muslim for purposes of the law in a manner that set forth what is institutionalized discrimination against the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. I wanted your thoughts, Mr. Minto, on the events thereafter and what the implications, the legal implications of having this constitutional amendment.
Well, the constitutional amendment was a disaster, in fact, in terms of law and constitution, and also in terms of peaceful society which Pakistan should have been right from the beginning. Because the fact that you make a community as a minority on the basis of its religious beliefs within the mainstream of the Muslim society itself. In fact, it could open up floodgates for discrimination between one and the other group within the mainstream itself. Now what you see is this: the Ahmadis are being discriminated within the mainstream Muslim community. Ahmadis are also discriminated as against the other minorities, in the sense that the other minorities are not by specific reference in the constitution or the law pinpointed as minorities who can be dealt with in a particular fashion, but the Ahmadis are. And the entire system of law, particularly the system of crime and punishment concerning the beliefs that has emerged after the 1974 constitution was amended, and particularly during the period of Ziaul Haq, has raised a whole system of separate jurisprudence, a whole system of a law which is from the basic, very beginning, a discriminatory law. So therefore, it has opened up floodgates. It has opened up floodgates in the society itself for treating one group of people as against the other in a discriminatory manner. Because if you lay down the foundations in the constitution and then follow it up in the normal law, then you are actually creating a society which is full of contradictions and conflicts.
And we will now get to, in more detail, the specific pieces of legislation subsequent to the Second Amendment that essentially institutionalized the discrimination of religious minorities. We had the opportunity to ask some of Pakistan's leading experts to share their impressions about the anti-blasphemy law and other criminal ordinances during President Zia-ul-Haq's time. Let's take a quick listen.
And the treatment of minorities, I think, was fine till General Zia-ul-Haq came to power, and Bhutto trying to make concessions to the right-wing populists in the country. The combination of these two things made conditions for minorities much worse. The big mistake Bhutto made, and I've written this many a time, that in trying to deal with the Islamist groups in Pakistan who were in a coalition, he thought he would steal their clothes. So he banned alcohol, he made Friday a public holiday, and one of the oldest demands of the hardcore Islamist groups was to declare the Ahmadiyas to be non-Muslims. He did that. It was not done by the right, it was not done by a military dictatorship, it was done by Bhutto, probably the most liberal prime minister we have ever had. And that, I think, was a huge tragedy for Pakistan, because it meant you could never roll it back. That had been done. Zia then, after he seized power in 1977, decided that this phase of the country's life was going to be Islamization, and he said so. So laws were promulgated during his years against religious minorities, the blasphemy laws were made worse, and the rights of women were severely truncated under that regime. And since that time, things haven't got better, they've got worse.
And the conditions in Pakistan, especially after 1977, when Zia-ul-Haq started a policy of Islamization according to his own interpretation of Islam. That changed the whole scenario and whole vision of Pakistan, which was in the mind and in the documents of Pakistan, which was in the mind of the founding fathers of Pakistan. Zia-ul-Haq violated all those principles, and he changed the mindset of the people in a way that whatever is happening now in Pakistan, we can say that we are reaping what Zia-ul-Haq and his companions, military companions and civilian companions, had planted in Pakistan.
There has been slaughter of Ahmadis also. Yesterday, day before yesterday, I believe a teacher was killed. I don't remember the city, just because he was an Ahmadi. We have still not forgotten what happened in Lahore. And periodically Rabwa can erupt, or periodically whenever somebody says. Now, the laws that Zia-ul-Haq has introduced, it is very strange that till date, if you talk about that law, it is akin to blasphemy. If you say that the procedure, the process of putting this law into motion needs to be checked so that it is not abused. From my perspective, every prophet is to be accepted, is to be honored.
Turning now to you, Mr. Rahman, a lot of international public opinion and the international community has drawn attention to Pakistan's blasphemy law and its effects on minorities. Help us understand what exactly is the blasphemy law and what were some of the events that led to its passage?
You see, looking at it from a lawyer practicing on the criminal side. I will give you a brief account of its background also. But these laws are so overbroad, so vague, and their implementation is so pervasive that the law itself is vitiated. Now, how these laws came into being, we have just now heard that Ziaul Haq had an agenda for whatever reasons in order to entrench him into power in Pakistan. He started a process of Islamization. Now, one of the first laws which he brought in, we had some laws under the chapter of religious offences, offences against religion in Pakistan Penal Code right from the British days. But those were very thoroughly debated, thoroughly drafted, with all the requirements of a criminal legislation. Those laws are finely defined. But the first law which he introduced, 298A and B, I am talking of 298B now. Now, blasphemy laws covers a wide range. 298B deals with defilement of Quran. Now, that law of defilement of Quran, actually, you know how it came about? I mean, when you try to project to the people the fundamentalist religious view, this is what happens. A terrorist, knowing that Ziaul Haq was talking about Quran and Islam and Sunnah, and he was placating it, a terrorist picked up a volume of Holy Quran. He cut its pages from inside and put a booby trap in it, and wanted to present that trap to Ziaul Haq. He would have blown up. So that was a terrorist activity. Quran was used for such a nefarious purpose. But it was used for that purpose because of the susceptibilities of Ziaul Haq. Nobody could have thought that he will use Quran for such a nefarious purpose. But a person did. And then came the law 298B, defilement of Quran. Good enough? Then thereafter came 295C. Now 295C deals with the defilement of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That law is also too broad, too vague. If I were to give you the words of the law, any person who by words visible, by words written or spoken, or by visible representation, or by insinuation, by innuendo, or any manner whatsoever defiles the name of the Holy Prophet. Now all these words, insinuation, innuendo, you can think infinite ways where the man can be brought under the law. It's so vague. If you go to the international criminal law jurisprudence, if you look at the criminal jurisprudence, you will say the criminal law has to be specific. The man has to be put in notice what he is supposed to do or what he is not supposed to do.
And to be clear, the specific language that you're referring to, that's the explicit language. So that facially, the language is vague. That indirectly or directly, by innuendo, by insinuation, these are standards that are difficult to enforce.
I mean, these are all subjective standards. These are all, the law has to be objective. I mean, a person who is being hauled up under the law, he doesn't know what would constitute defilement of the name of the Holy Prophet. I mean, and the examples are rampant in Pakistan. Anything. If I may give you an example, I don't want to take too long, but in Multan, a teacher of Islamic studies who belonged to Jamaat Islami was charged under 295C for defilement of the Prophet because he gave a translation of the Quranic verse which is known as Ayatul Kursi, where he said, "Who is it that who can intercede with God except with his permission?" And a student said, "Sir, but the Holy Prophet ﷺ will intercede for us on the Day of Judgment." He said, yes, my child, but with God's permission." And he said, "Oh, the Prophet ﷺ needs God's permission." And there was a case under 295C. And the man had to run to Mansoura in Lahore. I mean, so there is no end to even... this is surprising, you know, under 295C, the largest number of people who are booked are Muslims, in order to settle their own disputes. So the law is criminally, basically so vitiated that it has played havoc with our society.
Mr. Minto, I wanted to talk a bit about how broad the law is. and its broad application, the law has been used in to bring charges against well over 1,000 individuals. And these are individuals who are Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, the Ahmadi Muslims, Christians, and it's a broad range of individuals in Pakistan. Describe a bit your understanding of the purpose of the law. Was the law designed to affect such a broad cross-section of the community, and how has it been used legally?
Well, there are two aspects of the matter. My friend has already spoken about the vagueness of the law itself. You see, because I asked one of the supporters of this law, I said, if a non-Muslim of any persuasion, not necessarily the Ahmadis as declared non-Muslims under the law constitution, but any recognized non-Muslim was to be asked, who is the last prophet? He will naturally speak of his own prophet. So therefore, Jesus Christ is the last prophet for the Christians, and Moses and Abraham for the Jews. Does he by implication defile the name of the Prophet of Islam, sallallahu alaihi wasallam? So it's all the vagueness. You can imagine the vagueness of this. So it can be used anywhere, in any circumstances. Wherever you want to punish a person on the premise of his belief and faith and his own commitment in his own life, you can take up this law and use it against him. So therefore, aside from that, I remember a case that I did of a certain doctor. He was a regularly qualified doctor, was lecturing in a homeopathic institute where he was teaching medicine and perhaps pathology and something of that sort. And in fact, that institute was in the vicinity of a madrasa. And some of the madrasa people, teachers and boys, they were his students. And they knew about him, about the doctor, that he was a free man, he was a civil society activist, he was a human rights activist, and so forth. So they were trying to put all kinds of questions to him to pin him down somewhere. One of them asked him, was the Prophet of Islam married with the first wife, the Khudadatul Kubra, under the Islamic rites? Was there a nikah pronounced? Now naturally he was a student of history, and he said there was no Islam at that point of time, and therefore they were married according to the rites that were available at that point of time, prevalent in the society. Then he asked him another question, and he says, was the circumcision done to the Prophet of Islam? You see, this kind of a question, sinister questions to pin a person down, and a person who has a general understanding of the society and the life and the history, he will be answering questions according to his general information, and he will be caught down with this. Now this law does not say that intention is a necessary part of this matter. So you will see it is open-ended. You can take any person in any manner, whatever the context in which he made a statement or a gesture or an observation, that can be covered by this law. So this is the vagueness of the law. It is to be used in any circumstances which is suitable to the authority concerned.
And Mr. Rahman, separate and apart from Section 295C, what's called the blasphemy law, there are also specific criminal statutes that target by name the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, and these are known as Ordinance 20. Explain a bit about what Ordinance 20 is and what does it seek to regulate?
I think that Ordinance 20, one of the unique kind of statutes. I haven't seen any such statute anywhere else in the entire judicial legal history of many countries that I happen to have studied. It it picks out, singles out a community as such. Because criminal laws are usually whoever commits this or whoever does this shall be penalized. The laws of crime go like that. Whoever does this. Here, any person belonging to the Lahori or Ahmadi, Lahori or Qadiani group who call themselves Ahmadis. So whole group has been singled out for criminalization. Poses as a Muslim and goes on, directly or indirectly, and all those things. I am not giving you the words of the statute, but they are so vague. For instance, poses as a Muslim. Now the word pose is so vague. Anything can be termed as posing. If I wear a French cut beard, which is the fashion in Saudi Arabia, do I thereby pose to be a Muslim? Or if I wear a beard, long beard, according to the Sunnah of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, do I pose to be a Muslim? Sikhs wear a beard very much akin to the Muslim scholars. Many of Muslim ulama and many of the Sikhs cannot be identified their face, but by their face looking at their beard, does that Sikh pose to be a Muslim? So posing is two-way, and how, and in any other manner whatsoever, outrageous. I can give you some instances. I have traveled from Islamabad to Peshawar, from Peshawar to Quetta, and Quetta to Karachi, defending cases under 298. In Abbottabad, one gentleman was charged under 298C, and the FIR said, I was standing on the corner of the street and I heard Quran being recited inside the house of this gentleman. And the gentleman was hauled up, he was arrested. I had to go twice from Rawalpindi to Abbottabad to get him bailed out. But what was the fact? Any Ahmadi would recite Quran regularly in his house. So that is a given fact. But in this particular case, at that point of time, the gentleman switched on his TV, Pakistan Television was starting its program with the recitation of Holy Quran. And what the man heard in the street was the recitation of the Holy Quran from the Pakistan Television. And this man was charged under 298C. Another gentleman in Hazara, Rana Anayatullah by name, he was charged because as he passed through the street, I mean, this is a social behavior, normal salutation. He said, Assalamu alaikum sahab. And he was charged under 298C. You pose to be a Muslim. And he was sentenced to 3 years RI.
Very vague and overbroad statute, and certainly used in nefarious ways. We had the opportunity to interview some more experts on Pakistan about their impressions about these laws and about their impact. Let's take a quick listen.
Well, for that you have to go back to General Ziaul Haq's period because it was during his time. And then he also brought another ordinance which was discriminatory, and at that time he did that in order to satisfy the religious hardline clerics in Pakistan. Otherwise, in my view, it's not state's job to decide whether a particular person is following religion A, B. It's a relationship between an individual and God. And a person can follow any religion of his or her choice, and state can't make that kind of decision. But in order to satisfy the hardline religious leaders, this kind of condition was placed in the statement before you apply for passport, even for registration of vote. So it's a kind of pressure from the religious orthodoxy. Well, I think the state backing goes to the extent of 1984 ordinance which General Ziaul Haq had issued. That was a discriminatory law, and that is often invoked in Pakistan because that's part of Pakistani legal system now. That is often invoked against the Ahmadiyya community. Obviously, that cannot be invoked against any other community. Therefore, this law basically targets this community, and others are not really targeted by it. The reason is that with religious extremism growing, the different groups in the society are more vocal and more violent in dealing with the Ahmadiyya community.
in the past, when I was young, and people would say, why is it that Muslims never win any Nobel Prizes for science? And we used to say Abdul Salam was the co-winner of the Nobel Prize for physics. So it's not true. A Muslim has won a Nobel Prize for physics, not for anything else, for physics, a very advanced science. Today, you can't make that statement in Pakistan because it's illegal.
Absolutely.
But you can say that in India, it's fine. You can say that in Europe, it's fine.
Yeah.
You can say that in the United States, in Africa, it's fine, but not in Pakistan. And people don't see the absurdity of this.
I wanted to now turn briefly to the issue of political rights for minorities in Pakistan, and specifically the right to vote. We know that the right to vote is guaranteed in Pakistan's constitution. Mr. Minto, help us understand the history of the voting rights in Pakistan. Have religious minorities been able to vote in the same way as the majority?
Well, religious minorities in Pakistan are non-entities, I must say, right from the beginning. They were never recognized except for Mr. Jinnah's speech when he said that they are equal citizens. Notwithstanding the pretensions of the ruling people and the constitutional provisions here and there saying that everybody is equal. In fact, the minorities have never been treated equally. So therefore, right from the beginning, there has not been a proper treatment of the minorities. And when I say a proper treatment of minorities, I am only using the language which is commonly being used in this context. Otherwise, in my view, the treatment to a human being is the issue. A citizen of a country is a human being fundamentally, and he has to be treated as a human being, whether he is a man or a woman, believes in this or that religion, has any persuasion politically speaking. He has to be equally dealt with all other citizens in the country itself. That has not come to be, and the changes in the law and the constitution and the manner in which the views of a certain group of people who were the orthodox conformists and the right wingers in the matter of religion also, because in religion also you have progressive and modern and liberal interpreters of religion. That view was accepted for political purposes, and the result was that the whole society itself was geared towards a situation where the normal human considerations failed in front of the religious bias itself. So that is the result. So the religious communities have been suffering. It is not merely Ahmadiyas. Ahmadiyas have been specifically picked up for this purpose, but all other communities by default, in fact, they are also suffering in Pakistan.
And one of the implications or results of that suffering is, for a long time, Mr. Rahman, a separate electorate in Pakistan that was instituted for religious minorities as a way that they would vote separately from the mainstream majority. And so to talk a little bit about that issue.
That issue has been debated in Pakistan's political history since its very inception. But the basic idea which I try to project is that in a society which is, as a matter of fact, pluralist, which has many people with different faiths, different ethnic groups, so it is, as a matter of fact, a pluralist society. You convert the pluralist society and divide it, and you eliminate pluralism from the society, and the process of integration is seriously jeopardized when you provide separate electorate. Now that separate electorate system by itself is an absurdity in a political setup. Citizenship cannot be divided. Citizenship is indivisible. So that separate electorate for any religious group is a disintegrating process. Ultimately, this leads to a disintegration. If we want to build up a nation, and if we want to bring the solidarity in the nation, we have to bring all sections of the society together.
And to be fair, the separate electorate was abolished in 2002 under President Musharraf, when in February of that year he reinstated a joint electorate, and which was heralded by the international community as a positive step. But a few months later, by a stroke of a pen in Executive Order 15, he said that the status of Ahmadis was to remain unchanged. So you have the rather remarkable result that the only community that is disenfranchised and not part of the joint electorate are the Ahmadi community, and they can only vote if they declare themselves to be non-Muslim.
That is very interesting, that is very obvious. But I wanted to take you back a little in history. At the very inception, when we were working out our first constitution, and this issue came up, interestingly, the East Pakistan, which was the majority of Pakistan, they wanted to have a joint electorate, even though we had a large Hindu minority there. And the people in West Pakistan wanted to have separate electorate. But after a lot of debate, the question of separate electorate was not accepted by the Pakistan Constitution. But that bug remained in the Pakistan society, the fundamentalist pressures here, and the liberal attitude in this, that ultimately led to disintegration of Pakistan. What I am saying, it leads to disintegration. If we want to save Pakistan, we have to have one single electoral list, no division in the citizenship. And about Ahmadis, as you say, General Pervez Musharraf, he saw the reason. There was a lot of persuasion brought about by different sections of Pakistan's intelligentsia and even the Western people who value the democratic values. So he said, all right. And in any case, this separate electorate was an innovation of a martial law dictator. It was not our constitutional setup to start with. So Pervez Musharraf said joint electorate. But then again, the same bug. The pressure was brought on him, and he said, yes, joint electorate, but a separate list for the Ahmadis. What kind of joint electorate is that?
That's fascinating. I think the implications of this for the political rights of minorities are quite staggering. Well, that's all the time we have for today's program. I want to thank the panelists again for their illuminating thoughts. Our special series continues. Join us for next week's program, in which we take a look at the future of Pakistan and the prospects for improvements in minority rights. Thanks very much.